It's wonderful to welcome you all today to the first in what we hope will be a monthly series of webinars. We've got a couple of other great ones in development and we look forward to sharing those with you too. Deb just asked a little about me, how I come to be here today. And as you see on the screen, I'm one of the Canberra chapter co-leads, and you've got Amy Roberts, who's another, who's with us today. And another of my jobs is National Social Media Manager. And I came into AWSN, as I was just explaining to Deb, when we didn't actually have a name, when it was, as I've sometimes called, a twinkle in Jackie's eye. So what are we going to cover today? Well, other than introducing me in a couple of slides, we'll be looking at coronaviruses. I'm sure many of you until very recently hadn't even heard the term coronaviruses, and possibly now you wish you never had. The history of pandemics to try and give you some idea of the likely duration of what we're in at present. A few ideas about resuming business because it won't be normal. We quickly dropped off the business as usual, and I've got a slide about that in a moment, into an environment where everything changed almost overnight. Many people started working remotely or from home, which was quite different to being in a fixed office. We'll look a bit at the future of work. I'll be giving a presentation in mid-June on that topic because as a business continuity manager, and you might say, what's that got to do with security? Well, business continuity managers are about securing the business so that you continue. So that's the agenda for today. Oh, and yes, way back when I was a police officer, so I came into emergency management a very long time ago when I was hanging off ropes and doing hair-raising things in mountain rescue. As a police cadet, I got tangled up in the 74 Brisbane floods. I finished my policing career in the Commissioner's office with, as you see, very high-tech telephone services, which I had to share with a colleague who went on to become a superintendent. I've been in and out of emergency management, well, as of next year, in January, it will be 50 years. I did start very young. And more recently, I've been involved in some of the big stuff like counter-terrorism, the Bali bombings, the first anniversary for that, and the Indian Ocean tsunami. But I've also been much involved in the health emergency space, and that's why I'm talking to you today. So I was involved in AIDS, HIV education, needle and syringe programs back in the 80s when it wasn't very popular. And ironically, my current client, Directions Health Services, provides needle and syringe programs in the ACT. So it's like a full service. So I've been involved in those big plans. You see the images there on the slide. And more recently, I've been involved in reviewing pandemic business continuity plans and exercises and working with some offshore clients. I also work for the New South Wales Government on personal protective equipment for the Family and Community Services Department and the ACT Health when we actually had our last pandemic prior to COVID-19. And I'll talk a little about that too. Now, some of you with a longer memory might remember this, the Grim Reaper. And I'm putting it up here not to frighten everyone with the Grim Reaper ads again, they were very scary, but to remind you there's a lot of talk about a vaccine, and that's, I'll explain why, that's actually very hopeful because one of the coronaviruses that we've had historically poor success on is the common cold. We don't have a vaccine for that. We don't have a vaccine for AIDS or HIV, but the good news is we've got excellent treatments now and we've learnt to bring the preventative measures from acquiring that disease into part of our lifestyle. So it's a good news message. So in the case of the mid-80s or early 80s when AIDS, HIV was very scary to many people, we've moved on in our world and we've been able to integrate protecting ourselves from that and treating people who've been affected by that disease in much better ways rather than the huge death toll we had in that time in the 80s. Now, lots of people have been telling me that this is a black swan event. And I go, oh no, it's not. There's nothing black swan about this. If you were looking, if you saw that list of my experience in the health emergency space, this is not a black swan. We knew it was coming. I remember sitting in a very big meeting room in the Department of Health, the Australian government, with the then Chief Health Officer, Dr. John Hobart, who was talking about excuse me a moment, who was talking about, you got it, that the next pandemic, it wasn't if, but when. That was where our headspace should be when we were preparing. And he was absolutely right. We're in the when now. It was not unforeseeable. It was not improbable. It was highly probable, likely to be highly impactful, which it has been. And yet we neglected to prepare as much as we should. I've given you a book reference there, and you'll have the slides available to you at the end of the presentation. They're all up on Google Docs. Susanna and I managed to do that for you today. Now, some of you will be familiar with this excellent TED talk that Bill Gates gave back in 2015, where he was actually talking about the pandemic being a real risk to society as we knew it. He became very interested in the Ebola and was much involved in the development of the vaccine for Ebola, which is a particularly hazardous disease if you should get it. Unfortunately, it seems to be most prevalent in Africa. And in that, sorry, that's the joys of Skyping and Zooming and working from home. But he was making the point that we needed to be scenario planning, developing vaccine research. One of the things he's invested a lot of money in with his wife, Melinda, and their foundation is developing new mechanisms for vaccines. Because currently in the case of influenza, you'll notice when you sign off to have your influenza shot, they ask you about egg allergies because it relies on egg cultures to create that vaccine. And Bill, Melinda and their friends with lots of money have been working on other methodologies to deliver vaccines, which may actually bear fruit for us now in the environment of COVID-19. He finished his presentation by encouraging people not to panic, but to get going. And unfortunately, perhaps we could have done a bit more getting going. So I promised a few words on what are coronaviruses. And you'll notice there on the left a fancy looking description. Yeah, where it talks about novel coronaviruses, and that's very important to understand. This is a novel virus. None of us have immunity to it. It's all new. Our system has no capacity to deal with it in terms of existing immunity, unlike the common cold or other forms of influenza where our bodies had some experience of those things and developed some antibodies that might assist us. It's become called COVID-19, but it's also known as SARS-CoV-2, and we'll explain why it's called CoV-2 because there was a CoV-1. Now, as I mentioned, it's a group of related viruses. It attacks the respiratory tract, infects that, mild to lethal cases for mammals and birds. It includes the common cold, but also SARS-CoV-1, which is the so-called severe or sudden acute respiratory syndrome, which was a problem, particularly around Toronto, as well as some Asian countries in 2002 to 4. Then we had the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, MERS, which is still actually floating about. And then, of course, since November of 19, which we think that's when the Chinese first discovered something was going on with strange flus in Wuhan, COVID-19 came into scope, and its official name is SARS-CoV-2. Now, there are no vaccines and no treatments, no antiviral drugs at this point. We just do our best for people. And we hope, like AIDS in time, even if we don't achieve the vaccine, which is the gold standard, but we at least achieve some treatment options for people that are more robust and better tested. Where did SARS-CoV-1 come from? Draw this to your attention because SARS-CoV-1 was circulating, as I said, in 2002, 2004. And if you look down here, it's 2017 before the Chinese researchers were actually able to give us a definitive explanation of what happened. And it appears SARS-CoV-1 came from horseshoe bats into the endangered civets, into humans. MERS appears to have been bats to camels to humans, and it has a particularly alarming death rate, but fortunately is relatively focused in a limited number of countries who are obviously gaining in their experience of dealing with it. The most recent problem, which is now COVID-19, like the others, appears to have originated in bats, but we are not certain. You'll see an awful lot of dots and question marks. It's because we just don't know. And it may be many years before we know with some certainty. It is believed that it came out of bats again, and it appears the DNA RNA sequence tends to support that, maybe into pangolins and maybe into a wet market in Wuhan. There are so many maybes and so many uncertainties. That's the best guess we can make. It'll probably be a decade before we can tie that down with more certainty, and an awful lot of research to do that. Now, in case you think it's just these wet markets and bats and so on that are the problem, we in Australia have contributed to the pandemic with something called the Hendra virus, which is quite lethal too, and which, according to this map, if you look in the lower right corner here, has spread through Asia. It appears to have, the vector was flying foxes or possibly microbats into horses and into humans, particularly vets and other people that have close contact with horses. So that just gives you a bit of an oversight of coronaviruses so that you have a better understanding. But I say again, there are many uncertainties. And it's the history of pandemics that might give us some insights into the likely duration. So I'll slip over to those slides. Some of you may have seen this slide from Visual Capitalist, an excellent representation of the history of pandemics, but it does miss some important pandemics such as polio, measles and tuberculosis. But nonetheless, you see here, for instance, AIDS, Black Death, and of course, this is the figures from the WHO as of this morning in terms of the current death. If you prefer a tabular form, you can see that pandemics have been recorded way back in Roman times. So as soon as we had recorded history, we've had records of pandemics. It's believed that in Australia we may have had as many as 20 pandemics since, or at least outbreaks, if not pandemics, since Federation. Now, this is a busy slide, but I'll take a moment to explain it to you. You may have heard a lot of reference to the second wave and been wondering, what are they talking about? This is data that the CDC developed in 2009 relating to the pandemic, the 1918-19 so-called Spanish flu pandemic. It's based on UK data. And as you look at the graph here, you'll see that the first peak is the herald wave. We hope we're through that and that we're now in the pandemic wave. And it appears in China and Singapore, they may now be in the second or trailing waves. One of the reasons why so many of our political leaders have been so concerned about the second wave is that in the case of the 1918-19 pandemic, Spanish flu, or pneumonic influenza, the second wave somehow intensified the disease. So when people got sick in the second wave, they had a worse version of the disease, if that's possible to believe. And I put up the timing, because you look here, it took the CDC in 2009 to really analyse this data. So I mention these timelines to draw to your attention that all this will take a long time to unfold, the true story, and we will have many uncertainties for a very long time. Now, the duration of the Spanish flu, as it was called, and the reason why it was called Spanish flu wasn't because it actually commenced in Spain. It was because Spain was neutral during World War I and therefore didn't clamp down on propaganda, whereas we believe that this influenza possibly began in Kansas or maybe in France. There's some discussion, even to this day. It impacted a quarter of the world's population at the time and infected over 500 million people. It lasted 36 months. Basically, what happened there was you got the disease and you recovered and developed antibodies, or you died. They were your options. We had about 15,000 people in Australia and about 40% of our population was impacted. Along with World War I, the Spanish flu had huge demographic, social and economic impacts, such as we're likely to see with COVID-19. We've had other pandemics, I'll just skip over those, and draw your attention to the most recent pandemic before the this one, COVID-19. And there you'll see that the elapsed time was about 18 months, but in this case, we did actually develop a vaccine. The death rate was modest by pandemic standards, but no comfort to the 191 people who did die, or to the 37,000 plus people who became very unwell. You'll also notice it was out of sync between the northern and the southern hemisphere. It took a while to get to the southern hemisphere, and because it's a winter-focused disease, it took a bit longer for the outbreak to be declared over in Australia. But we're looking there at 18 months. So where are we now, and where did all this come from, the COVID-19? If you look at the first sit rep, as I've brought up here for you from the World Health Organization, that was issued on the 21st of January 2020, and it related to a report from China dating from the 31st of December about pneumonia of unknown origin, I think as they call it, unknown etiology. Fairly soon after that, if you look in the lower right corner, you'll see that the cases started to be reported in Thailand, Japan, and South Korea, which obviously led to this SITREP. The World Health Organization quickly worked out this disease was not being restricted to China. So they held a meeting of these heavy hitters. You'll recognise the fellow in the middle, and the others are quite important epidemiologists or other people in public health from their representative countries. And on the same day that they met, which was the 30th of January, in Geneva, they declared a public health emergency of international concern. And by the 11th of March, they declared it a pandemic. My colleagues and I were jumping up and down on LinkedIn saying, why aren't they declaring it a pandemic? Well, the strict rules require you to have it community spread in two continents. And it was a bit hard to lock that down in Europe. It was definitely the case in Asia. And this is why there was a fair bit of elapsed time between declaring it a health emergency and a pandemic. This is this morning's sit rep from the World Health Organization. You'll notice that the deaths continue to grow. In Australia, our last figure was 84 and our confirmed cases were approaching 7,000. There's another important message here that I've drawn to your attention. It is so important, if you possibly can, to have your seasonal influenza shot, because it is possible for you to get both. And not having your shot may mask some of the treatment for COVID-19. So it's vitally important that you get your health shot unless you have any contraindicated. Again, people have been talking at length about flattening of the curve, so I thought I'd just give you a few moments to see what that looks like. And in the case of Australia, it was released on the 6th of April. This so-called data, the epidemiological data on which some of the decisions are being made. And you'll notice that the uncontrolled environment is a very big spike. The quarantine and isolation flattens the curve a bit, but the isolation, quarantine and social distancing really flattens the curve. And you'll see why. So if we hadn't flattened the curve, we would have needed to find 35,000 ICU beds. At the time, we had 2,378 ICU beds, which is nowhere near enough to deal with an uncontrolled pandemic like this. Even if we had just enforced some of the restrictions, we would have still needed more than 15,000 ICU beds. But by insisting on these greater restrictions with social distancing, we now have what appears to be sufficient ICU beds based on the predictions that the epidemiologists have been working on with Health, Department of Health in the Australian government, and each of the Australian governments have been contributing their epidemiologists. So you'll see that the good news is that we've jumped up our capacity by 191%. So we now have over 6,000 beds. Nonetheless, with a second wave spike, that may not be enough, because we may be getting back closer to these waves, even if restrictions are quickly introduced and complied with. So how are we going to resume some sort of business, which is the space I operate in as a business continuity manager? Well, we've had a lot of impacts already. as a result of COVID-19, for instance. In my own case, I lost my job. Luckily, I'm a consultant, so somebody else decided they needed my services, so I lost one job and got another. Oh well. But in the tourist space, we've had great problems, particularly from the bushfires, but international education is another important export, and money and confidence. You will have seen the stock market problems. The $A dropped badly. That has real implications. This is a slide from another presentation, international presentation that I gave last month. But you'll see that tourism contributes a significant part of our export market, as does international education. These are just behind iron ore and coal and ahead of gold and natural gas. So it's a significant part of our GDP. The loss of tourists, particularly from our bushfires and then more recently COVID, especially Chinese tourists, who, as you see, make up 25% of our tourism dollar. How long is this going to last? Well, I came across this yesterday from Dave, who's the Boeing CEO, speaking to his shareholders and saying that he thinks it'll be 2023, maybe longer, before the airlines start to recover anything like the traffic that they previously had. And in the case of the Austrian CEO of Austrian Airlines, he was saying something similar a few days beforehand. So now that doesn't mean that restrictions will continue to hold for that length of time, but that some of the air travel and economic issues will have a very long tail. International education is another biggie. The loss of Chinese students is a real problem. And as you'll see, it's very big dollars in the university sector. So how is it going to affect our economy? Well, the OECD has kindly put out a report in February saying that Australia is likely to be one of the countries worst affected by the economic fallout from coronavirus. Oh, thank you for that. Things like the OECD. More locally, the three stimulus packages that the Australian government has released account for 320 billion Australian dollars and 16.4% of the GDP. I was speaking with Jackie the other day and saying that your kids will still be paying this off. This is effectively a credit card debt. That is, we borrowed all this money, we printed money, we bought government bonds, issued lots of bonds as well as buying them back. It's like maxing out your credit card on steroids. We can expect unemployment to grow. It will be worse than 1992 by the looks of the current data. Without JobKeeper, it'll be worse again. Probably around 15% is what they estimated if they hadn't put in the JobKeeper package, which is the third stimulus. So the economic shock of coronavirus is likely to be greater than the global financial crisis. Some people have been quoting a figure from, I'm not sure whether it was the OECD, that the world's sort of gross domestic product dropped by 0.1% for the GFC, 2007-8. For coronavirus, they think it could be as high as 3. So we'll have a huge impact economically. Oh yes, there it is. Now, the future of work. Where are we going with all this? When the restrictions are lifted, we will not return to business as usual. That is transparent to those of us who work in this space. And some of us are increasingly talking about something called a next normal. Now, in the emergency management space, we've talked about a so-called new normal for a very long time, but we're recoding it to a next normal because it's even more futuristic for us to work out what that long tail will look like and what changes we can expect. And now we have a Prime Minister that keeps talking about snapping back, but some of us would rather snap forward. We'd rather take this opportunity to possibly move into more AI, more big data, more blockchain, more this, more that. So why would we want to go back? And I often speak with CIOs about their business and restoring Data Center 1 and so on. I remember one of them mirthfully saying, no lunatic would restore Data Center 1 like it is. with all its legacy systems, and goodness knows, heavens knows, we do it differently. And maybe many businesses are looking for this opportunity to do things differently. And it seems that John Hewson's view is that we should be looking towards the forward rather than the back as well. This is a big slide, but it's combined some ideas that my colleague David Lindstad's been putting out in his webinars. He's one of the thought leaders in the business continuity space. So basically the purple and white is him, and some of the edge bits are mine. I've been trying to get my clients to understand that we had a pre-COVID-19 business as usual. Then we suddenly hit, and that's why you've got this black sort of ski jump. It's how I describe it. Excuse me, where we went from business as usual to business that was very unusual very quickly. Some of us suddenly found ourselves working from home. Business as usual for me is working from home, but I noticed that the internet slowed down because of lots of traffic on the NBN. David then argues, and I argue, we've settled into now a business as usual during COVID, but then that's about to be disrupted as the restrictions are released. Increasingly released. So we're in a compliance and cooperation phase, but we're going to explore, excuse me, as the restrictions are released, we're going to explore how that works and be very carefully monitoring it. At this point, we have no treatment. We'll be looking at adaptation and competition, but we'll also be looking for prevention, treatment. The gold standard seems to be vaccination. Whether it'll create a cure is be interesting to see. If you look at our current flu vaccine, we have to have it every year, so we obviously haven't fully addressed that. But nonetheless, having that flu vaccine reduces the severity of the illness. And you'll see that I've got a dotted line taking us out of our current state into the new or next normal, which is a very uncertain state. But it's giving people interested in futurist leadership thinking like me and my business continuity colleagues lots to think about. So just pointing out some of the thinking, the virtual office. So will we actually go back into the close quarters that we were having? Possibly not. There could be an advantage of carbon footprint. We will be possibly commuting less. We may not be great fans of open offices after this. Sorry. We may be less interested in open plan offices because if we return to fixed locations, we might have to have more space between participants. Rarer skills, which we already know in the cyberspace is amongst the rare skills list, will become more in demand, and eliminating workplace bias. It was interesting when I looked at what Jeffrey James was writing here, it's actually quite a lot about diversity. So dealing with ageism, I know something about that, but also just diversity more generally, because you can describe yourself as an avatar and therefore be less judged, for want of a better term. So it's opportunities for all of us. You can pivot your business, you can pivot your career. You've got an opportunity for a lot of online training if you're between opportunities, as I now find myself or will be very soon. Sorry, local bugs. There are many skills that we will need to succeed in a post-coronavirus world. And here's a few ideas from Bernard Ma. If you're not already following Bernard on LinkedIn, you might like to do it. He's a futurist thinker and he tends to put up a post most days. So he's saying that the skills we need are, as you see there, adaptability, tech savviness, creativity, innovation, data literacy, critical thinking, digital and coding skills, which many of you have, leadership, and emotional intelligence. And I'll come back to that whole notion of leadership and emotional intelligence before I wrap up. So I now subscribe to Kellogg's Insights. If you don't, you might be interested to do so. And they interviewed this fellow, Harry M. Kramer, who formerly was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and asked him what skills would leaders need to bring their businesses out of COVID-19, the current crisis, into the new world order, whatever that might be? And he made a couple of interesting points. And I thought this whole notion of you can't be certain that you'll be doing the right thing, but that you do the best you can. And they certainly resonated with me with my policing career. We couldn't save everyone, but we always did our best. And often when I had to deliver bad news about the death of somebody in their family, I would be telling them that we did our best, but unfortunately it wasn't sufficient to save their loved one. So here you'll be telling people what you know, which often, as I've just explained from the earlier slides, there's lots of things we don't know about COVID-19, but we'll provide the best information we can to settle people down. I mean, even if the information is thin and sketchy, nonetheless, it's reassuring to have some idea. And here's some resources that you'll get in your slide pack. There's an excellent work from the colleagues in Copenhagen, which you might find useful for your businesses and your thinking, if not about your business, about your own career. The McKinsey work, they've been producing an excellent series of papers. I mentioned my colleague David Lindstad, who's made available a corona management system, which is very useful for businesses, as is the Noggin epidemic response module, which is free. If you'd be interested in availing yourself of those options. I've also mentioned some very helpful colleagues, such as my friend Regina and Jim and Charlie and Bernard and two Bernards. A local fellow, Bernard Salt, you might be familiar with his excellent work too. He's a bit like Bernard Mara, although Bernard Salt's a demographer, is often writing about the future of business, which is quite relevant as we move out of the post COVID-19 restrictions, to start thinking about that now before all of those restrictions are removed. So we're at any questions?